In the summer of 1861, a committee of the United States House of Representatives began taking sworn testimony about what the federal government had been buying with the money it was spending to fight the Civil War. The committee was looking into weapons, horses, blankets, and uniforms. What it found in the footwear contracts was that men had been paid public money for shoes with soles built from wood shavings, glued paper, and scraps swept up off a factory floor, dyed and finished, so they would pass inspection long enough to be handed to a soldier. Those shoes held together in a warehouse. They held together on a parade ground. They came apart on a road in the rain, sometimes within a single day's march. The United States in 1861 had the industrial capacity to build railways, iron ships, and rifled artillery. It could not reliably put a working shoe on the foot of an infantryman, and the reason was not that the country lacked leather. The reason was that somebody had worked out how much money there was in the difference. The object at the center of this is the most ordinary thing a person owns. It is probably by your door right now. So how does the simplest piece of equipment a soldier carries end up killing more of them than the enemy? And how does a fraud committed over shoe leather in 1861 still shape American federal law today? To understand the scale of what that committee found, you have to understand a word that entered the English language in those years and has never left it: shoddy. Shoddy was a real material with a real industrial definition. Wool waste, old rags, and worn-out garments were shredded back into loose fiber, respun, and pressed into new cloth with sizing and glue to hold the short, broken fibers together. It looked like woolen cloth. It felt reasonably like woolen cloth. In dry weather, it behaved like woolen cloth. In rain, the sizing washed out, and the garment came apart in the wearer's hands. The Union Army bought enormous quantities of it in the first year of the war, along with everything else it bought in a hurry. And the word crossed over from a technical term for reclaimed wool into an insult that Americans still use to describe anything cheaply made. That transfer happened in those specific months, over those specific contracts. Footwear was worse than the uniforms, because a coat that falls apart makes a man cold, and a shoe that falls apart makes a man useless. The mechanism of the fraud was straightforward. A well-made shoe of the period had a sole built from layers of stout leather, stitched or pegged through with hardwood pins, and the strength of the whole thing lived in the quality of those layers. A dishonest maker could substitute almost anything for the inner layers. Chips, shavings, compressed paper board, leather scrap glued into a slab. Then he closed it up between two thin outer layers of real leather, blacked it, and it looked exactly like a shoe. An inspector handling it saw leather. A quartermaster stacking it in a crate saw leather. A soldier who put it on and stood in a warehouse saw leather. Then the man marched 20 miles in wet weather. The glue softened, the compressed filler swelled and disintegrated, and the sole opened like a book. Accounts from the first 2 years of the war described regiments losing footwear at a rate that made units combat ineffective, men marching in strips of blanket tied around their feet, and roads marked by discarded shoes that had lasted days. This was not an army short of shoes. It was an army that had bought shoes and been sold something shaped like shoes. Congress did not treat that as bad luck, and what it did about it turned out to matter far more than the war it was responding to. The investigations of 1861 and 1862 produced a mass of documented fraud across every category of army supply. And the problem the government faced was not proving that it had happened. The problem was enforcement. Federal prosecutors were few. Contracts had been let in a rush by officers scattered across a continent. The people best placed to know that a shoe was filled with paper were not federal investigators in Washington. They were clerks, foremen, and workers inside the contractor's own operations, and those people had no reason on earth to come forward and every reason to stay quiet. In March of 1863, Congress passed a law to solve exactly that problem. It is formally the False Claims Act, and it is still commonly called the Lincoln Law after the president who signed it. It made submitting a false claim to the federal government a civil offense with heavy penalties, and it did something more unusual. which is the part that survived. It allowed a private citizen with knowledge of a fraud against the government to bring a lawsuit on the government's behalf and to keep a share of whatever was recovered. That provision has a Latin name, quitam, and what it does in practice is turn the insider into a plaintiff. The clerk who knows what is inside the soul is no longer a man with a dangerous secret. He's a man with a financial stake in telling. That law is still in force. It has been amended, most substantially in 1986. And it is today the principal weapon the United States government uses against contractor fraud of every kind. It is the mechanism behind the great majority of federal fraud recoveries in defense contracting, in healthcare billing, and in pharmaceutical marketing. The sums recovered under it run into the billions of dollars annually, decade after decade. Every one of those cases traces its authority back to a statute written because men were sold shoes filled with paper. That is the first thing about this object that almost nobody knows. Here is the second, and it is stranger because it is about the shoes you are wearing right now. For most of the history of footwear, shoes had no left and no right. They were made on a straight last, a single symmetrical wooden form, and both shoes of a pair came off the same shape. You bought two identical objects and you wore them until your own feet distorted the leather into the shape of your feet. Some people swapped them from foot to foot each day, deliberately, so they would wear evenly and last longer. This was not ignorance. Cordwainers had understood for centuries that human feet are asymmetric. Straight lasts persisted anyway, for reasons that were entirely practical. One last is cheaper than two. One last means no sorting, no mismatched inventory, and no shoe left unsold because it is a left with no right. And a shoe that is worn until it molds to the foot arrives at a fit that a stock right or left could not match at the cost of some weeks of pain. Distinct rights and lefts, sometimes called crooked shoes, existed in the trade and were being made in the United States by the early 1800s. What changed the default was mass production for armies. When you are making 100,000 pairs to be handed to 100,000 men who will wear them within days, the breaking-in period stops being a private inconvenience and becomes a strategic problem. An army cannot spare 3 weeks for its soldiers' feet to shape their footwear, and the Civil War, more than any single event, pushed American manufacturing toward producing shoes that were already shaped when they left the factory, which meant somebody now had to decide what shape a foot actually is. And it turned out that in more than 2,000 years of organized warfare, nobody had ever properly measured one. In the years before the First World War, an officer in the United States Army Medical Corps named Edward Munson set out to do something that sounds too obvious to have needed doing. He decided to find out what shape a soldier's foot is by measuring a great many of them. His work was published in 1912, and it did two things. The first was to establish, with data rather than tradition, that the fashionable shoe shape of the period was wrong for a working foot. Civilian shoes tapered inward at the toe, pushing the big toe toward the middle of the foot. Munson's measurements showed that a healthy foot is widest across the toes and that its inner edge runs close to straight from heel to big toe. A boot built the fashionable way was compressing exactly the part of the foot that carries the body forward at the end of every stride. The second finding is the one that should change how you buy shoes for the rest of your life. Munson measured feet under, load. He had soldiers stand with full field equipment, the pack, the rifle, the ammunition, the water, everything a man actually carries, and he measured them again. The foot is not a fixed object. It is an arched structure of bones held together by soft tissue, and under weight that arch flattens and spreads. The foot gets longer, the foot gets wider. Load a man with 40 or 50 pounds, and the change is not subtle. It can be most of a shoe size, which means a boot fitted to a man standing empty in a warehouse in the morning is the wrong boot for that man carrying his equipment in the afternoon. It was too small in every direction at exactly the moment it mattered, and it had been too small for every army in history. The Munson last that came out of that work has a wide toe box and a nearly straight inner edge, and it went into American military footwear and stayed there for decades. If you have ever put on a work boot and thought it looked blunt and unfashionable across the front, you were looking at the ghost of a doctor measuring feet before the First World War. Stand up and press your thumb across the front of whatever you have on right now. If your toes are being pushed together, your shoe is built on the tradition Munson spent his career arguing against. That is the kind of thing this channel exists to find, and if it is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing and takes about a second. The rest of this story gets much worse. Because 2 years after Munson published, the armies of Europe walked into a war that turned out to be fought standing in water, and the boot stopped being a piece of clothing and became a medical problem. The condition has several names. Trench foot is the one that stuck, and the mechanism has nothing to do with freezing. Feet that are kept wet and cold and immobile for long periods above the freezing point suffer damage to the small blood vessels and the nerves. Circulation degrades. The foot swells, goes numb, changes color, and in advanced cases, the tissue dies. Severe cases ended in amputation. The trenches of the Western Front in the winter of 1914 were close to a laboratory designed to produce it. Men stood in standing water in their boots for days at a time, unable to remove them, unable to dry them, unable to move enough to keep blood flowing. The British Army recorded something in the order of 20,000 cases in that first winter alone. In some sectors, in some months, more men were removed from the line by their own feet than by German fire. There was no drug for it and no equipment fix that worked on its own, and the eventual solution was administrative, which is why it is one of the strangest passages in military medicine. Armies attacked the problem by rotating men out of flooded positions on a schedule, by requiring dry socks to be carried and changed, by ordering feet to be inspected regularly, and by rubbing the feet with grease before a man went forward. The most commonly issued grease was whale oil, which is to say that the same trade that emptied the world's oceans of whales also ended up smeared on the feet of the British infantry. And the command structure did something it very rarely does. It made officers personally accountable for the feet of their men. A unit with high rates of trench foot was treated as a unit with a failure of command rather than a run of bad luck. And the responsibility for checking that every man had dry socks landed on named individuals with careers to lose. Rates fell. The boot problem itself took another 50 years to solve properly, and the solution came from a different jungle in a different war. American footwear, developed for Vietnam, abandoned the idea that you could keep water out of a boot in a place where a man walks through a river every day. It accepted that the boot will fill, and it put screened drainage eyelets low on the instep so the water could leave, with canvas panels that dried fast, and a deeply cut sole pattern designed to shed mud rather than pack it. The design principle was an inversion of everything footwear had assumed. Stop trying to keep the water out. Give it a way out. By that point, though, the military boot had already escaped the military, and it had done so by way of a German doctor with a broken ankle. In 1945, a German army physician named Klaus Martens injured his ankle skiing in the Bavarian Alps. Recovering and unable to tolerate the stiff standard-issue boots he owned, he began building himself something softer. Germany, at the end of the war, was a country made largely of salvage, and what Martens had access to was scrap, including rubber from military vehicles. He built a sole out of it with sealed air pockets trapped inside so that the sole itself flexed and absorbed impact instead of transmitting every step up through the heel. He and an engineer he had known at university, Herbert Funk, began producing them. Their first substantial market was middle-aged German women with foot complaints, which is not the customer base the boot is now associated with. In 1959, they advertised for international licensees. A shoemaking firm in Northamptonshire, England, the traditional heart of British boot making, took the license, changed the shape, added a heel loop and yellow welt stitching, and put the first British pair on sale on the 1st of April, 1960. It was sold as a work boot, Its customers were postmen, factory workers, warehousemen, and police. It was cheap, it was comfortable on a concrete floor for 10 hours, and it was profoundly unfashionable. Then it was adopted over the following decade by British working-class youth subcultures who wore it precisely because of what it signaled. It moved from skinheads to punks, to two-tone, to goths, to Britpop, changing political meaning several times along the way, while the object itself barely changed at all. And it ended up in shop windows on every continent as a fashion item at many times its original price. An orthopedic aid, built from salvaged tire rubber by a doctor who could not walk properly, became one of the most recognizable symbols of youth rebellion in the 20th century. The American version of that story happened 30 years later, and it started in New England. In 1973, a shoe company in New Hampshire, run by the Swartz family, introduced a boot built with an injection molded process that fused the sole to the upper without a stitched seam. The seam is where water gets in. Removing it produced a genuinely waterproof leather boot at a price ordinary working men could pay. They called the boot Timberland. It sold so well that within 5 years, the company renamed itself after it. It was designed for New England. It was made for men working outdoors in wet cold, for construction crews and loggers, and anyone who spent a winter standing on frozen ground, and it was sold through hardware stores and work clothing suppliers. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was adopted by a group of customers nobody in New Hampshire had planned for. In New York, the 6-inch wheat-colored boot became a fixture of hip-hop dress, worn in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in Queens, and then on album covers and in videos that carried it across the world. The reasons given by the people who wore it were practical before they were symbolic. It was warm, it was waterproof, it survived a winter of standing outside in a city, and it was built well enough that it did not need replacing every season. Those are the same reasons a logger in New Hampshire bought it. The company's relationship with that audience was complicated in the early years, and it was publicly reported as such at the time. A work boot manufacturer selling to construction crews found itself, without any marketing effort, at the center of a culture it did not understand and had not sought. There were years in which it kept its distance. That did not last because the numbers did not allow it to. The boot's association with American urban culture became one of the most valuable things the company owned, and it eventually built its marketing around it. And in the same decades, at the far more mundane end of the same object, the workplace boot was being rewritten by law. Reinforced toe caps had existed since the early 20th century, but it was the creation of federal workplace safety regulation in the United States in 1970, and the enforcement standards that followed it, that turned protective footwear from a sensible option into a legal requirement across whole industries, which is where the two halves of this story meet. The same object was being pulled into fashion at one end and into federal regulation at the other, and both of those forces trace back to the same starting point, which is a government discovering that it had been sold shoes filled with paper. So look at the boots by your door. They have a left and a right, and that is newer than you would guess. For most of the history of the object, both shoes came off the same wooden form, and you were expected to spend a few weeks of pain persuading the leather to become the shape of you. The front of them is probably wider than fashion would prefer, and if it is, that shape came out of an American army doctor measuring thousands of feet before the First World War and discovering that everybody had been fitting boots at the wrong moment, because a foot under load is a bigger foot than a foot standing empty. The sole is sealed against water, and that is not because someone wanted to keep your feet dry for comfort. It is because armies lost 20,000 men in a single winter to feet that stayed wet, and because the eventual answer, after 50 years, was to stop fighting the water and give it a drain. If they are, Dr. Martens, you are wearing a sole that a German doctor built out of scrap tire rubber because he had hurt his ankle and could not bear his own army's boots. And whatever they are, The reason a modern government contractor thinks twice before filling a sew with paper is a law signed in 1863, still on the books, still recovering billions of dollars a year. Written because men in the Union Army marched into the rain and came out barefoot. Nothing else you own carries that much history and asks so little of you. This is the kind of history you want more of. Subscribe to Fabric Myths, because almost everything you put on your body has a story like this one underneath it, and most of them are stranger than you would expect. And tell me 2 things in the comments. First, which part of this surprised you most? Because for most people, it is either the fact that shoes had no left and right, or the fact that your foot changes size when you pick up a heavy bag. And second, where in the world you are watching from, because I'm always curious how far these stories travel. Then tell me which object you want next. And if you want to know where the leather itself came from, and how the oldest material humans ever wore ended up as armor on the bodies of soldiers for 4,000 years, go watch The History of Leather, the ancient hide that armored civilization. It is the same material several thousand years earlier, doing an even harder job.